Your sister is more caring. Mom shouted, leaving her in charge of Grandpa's medication. At the funeral, my aunt whispered, he was begging for help. No one came. I didn't expect to be standing at the graveside that day, feeling as if I was burying more than just my grandfather. He had passed away quietly in the night, after months of slowly deteriorating health. My family, Mom, Julia, Aunt Ruth, gathered around as we went through the motions of a funeral, but it felt like we were all just waiting for it to be over. None of us had really come to terms with it, not really. Not the way we should have. It was hard not to feel the weight of everything that had led up to this moment. I had been the one to look after Grandpa when he could no longer care for himself. Mom, as always, did the bare minimum. She would come and sit by his bedside for an hour each morning, mostly to check off her good daughter box, and then she'd disappear into her room. That was the routine. And then there was Julia, my sister, who had barely visited. She lived only a few towns away, but I might as well have been in another country for all the help she gave. One night, after a particularly rough day with Grandpa, I lost it. I had spent hours trying to get his medication right. The dosage had to be precise, but with everything going on, I felt like I was drowning in all the details, unable to keep up. I called Mom, hoping she'd help. Mom, I'm really struggling with Grandpa. He's having another episode. I don't know what to do. Her voice on the other end was calm, detached. Isabel, I told you already. You need to follow the chart. You know what to do. I glanced over at Grandpa, struggling to breathe, and I felt this crushing weight of responsibility. I can't remember the dosage. I need you here. There was a long pause. Then, in that same, practiced tone, she said, your sister is more caring. Maybe you should ask her to help. I felt my heart drop to my stomach. Julia? The same sister who hadn't even bothered to check in on Grandpa for weeks. I slammed the phone down, tears stinging my eyes, feeling a mix of anger and hopelessness. The truth hit me then, no one cared like I did. Not really. I was the one who had to be there, had to make the hard decisions. And no one noticed. Not even Grandpa, who had slipped into a dazed, unconscious state most of the time. Yet, every now and then, when his eyes flickered open, he would look at me like he knew I was the only one there for him. A week later, I stood beside his bed as his breathing slowed. He was already slipping away, but he looked at me in that moment with such clarity, almost as if he was trying to say something important. Help me, he whispered, barely audible. I leaned in, my heart racing. Grandpa, I'm here. What do you need? His grip on my hand tightened for a second, then loosened again. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with pain and fear. No one listens, no one, his voice trailed off, and I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. He wasn't just asking for help in that moment, he was telling me something. Something deep and painful. But there was nothing I could do. I could give him his medication, try to ease his suffering, but it wasn't enough. Not really. The next morning, when I went into his room, Grandpa had passed. I sat there for hours, unable to move, unable to process. How had I missed it? Had I done enough? Mom, as expected, took over the funeral arrangements with the same efficiency she applied to everything. There was no emotion behind it, just business. Julia arrived late, of course, as always. She breezed in with her flawless hair and perfect makeup, as if nothing had happened. No apology, no acknowledgement of what had gone on. The funeral itself was a blur. I couldn't even bring myself to say much. People came and went, offering their condolences in the same half-hearted way they always did. The whole thing felt like a performance, a show that no one was really invested in. Afterward, I went outside to get some air, away from the noise, away from the well-meaning but empty words. That's when Aunt Ruth found me. She had always been the one who didn't hold back, the one who told it like it was. I'd always admired her for her bluntness. She sat down beside me, her weathered hands holding a cigarette as she stared out at the horizon. "You okay, kid?" she asked, her voice soft but heavy with something unspoken. I didn't know how to answer her. What could I say? "I don't think I can ever forgive them," I finally said. "Mom. Julia, they just let him suffer." Aunt Ruth didn't say anything for a long while, just stared at the ground. When she did speak, her voice was low, almost a whisper. "I need to tell you something, Isabel." I looked at her, sensing something important was coming. "Your granddad wasn't just dying. He was begging for help." I didn't know what to do. He asked me to help him, but there was nothing I could do. "But I'll tell you this, no one listened to him. Not your mother, not Julia. They all just let him fade away. He told me he couldn't breathe, that he was suffocating. He begged for someone to help him, and no one did." Her words hit me like a punch. I could barely breathe, let alone process what she was saying. Grandpa had been asking for help. Real help. And no one, not even me, had fully understood what he was going through. I couldn't stand to watch it anymore, Isabel. I couldn't help him. But I should have. We all should have. Aunt Ruth's voice cracked, and I could see the tears welling up in her eyes. I had never seen Aunt Ruth cry before, but there it was, raw, vulnerable emotion. I wanted to say something, but I couldn't. I just sat there, numb, trying to come to terms with everything that had happened. How had it all gone so wrong? How had we allowed him to suffer like that? I don't know how long we sat there in silence, but when I finally looked up, I felt a strange sense of clarity. Aunt Ruth was right. No one had listened. Not until it was too late. But I'm not done processing yet. The guilt, the anger, it all still lingers. And I'm left wondering, what now? How do you fix a family that's broken? How do you forgive people who didn't even see what was wrong until it was too late? I don't know, but I need to figure it out. Maybe it starts with me. Maybe it starts with understanding that I wasn't the only one who failed. It was all of us. And we all have to live with that now. But I'm not sure where that will lead. The days following Grandpa's funeral were a blur. It felt like a strange kind of numbness had settled over me, like the world had gone on without me while I stood still, frozen in place. I stayed in Kingston for a few more days, mostly out of obligation. I'd gone to the funeral and dealt with the aftermath, but I hadn't truly confronted the reality of what happened. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Mom, for her part, had returned to her usual routine almost immediately after the funeral. She never talked about Grandpa's last days or showed any signs of grief. To be fair, she had always been this way, emotionally distant. I used to think it was just her way of coping, but now it seemed more like an unwillingness to face the truth. She threw herself back into her daily activities as though Grandpa's death was just another event to check off the list, like a bill to be paid. It was hard to ignore the guilt and resentment I felt toward her. She hadn't been there for Grandpa when he needed her most. She hadn't stepped up in any meaningful way, yet she seemed perfectly content to let me take on the burden. And when I needed her the most, when I was scrambling to figure out what was best for Grandpa, she had dismissed me, told me that Julia would be better suited to handle the situation. And then there was Julia. I still couldn't understand why she had been so absent. She hadn't visited Grandpa regularly, and when she did, it was like she was checking in, not caring. It wasn't like her life was so busy that she couldn't make time for family. She lived just 30 minutes away, but she rarely made the effort to come by and help. I had seen the perfect life she had built for herself, her perfect house, perfect kids, perfect husband, and it only made me feel more alienated. I reached out to her a few times, trying to talk about what had happened, about the guilt I felt for not being able to do more for Grandpa. But each time, it felt like she brushed me off. She didn't want to engage in a real conversation. I suppose it was easier for her to pretend nothing had happened than to face the harsh reality of what we had all failed to do. I couldn't get over the fact that she was so unaffected by Grandpa's death. And even now, she didn't seem to want to talk about what had gone on. At the funeral, she'd barely acknowledged my feelings, let alone the fact that Grandpa had suffered so much in his final days. It was my Aunt Ruth, though, who had truly shaken me. Her words had hit me hard, not just because of the guilt they triggered, but because they made me realize something I hadn't fully acknowledged until then. Grandpa wasn't just suffering physically. He had been pleading for help, and none of us had really heard him. He had been begging, not just for medication or relief, but for someone to see him, to care, and to not let him slip away alone. I kept going back to those final moments with him. His hand in mine. His eyes, wide with fear. The way he had whispered "help me," as though he was trapped in a body that no longer obeyed him. Those moments still played on loop in my head, like a broken record. Could I have done something differently? Could I have done more to make sure he wasn't in pain, to make sure someone was there when he needed it most? I didn't have answers. But I couldn't let it go. I couldn't just move on as if everything was fine. Aunt Ruth's confession lingered in my mind. She had been the only one willing to tell me the truth, and even though it hurt, it also made me realize that I wasn't alone in carrying the burden. She had seen what I saw, Grandpa's suffering, and it was clear that she regretted not stepping in sooner. But it was hard to forgive my mom and Julia, who had seemed to ignore the reality of what Grandpa was going through. There was no real closure after the funeral. Just more silence. More awkward conversations with my mom, who still avoided talking about anything that mattered. I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine with her, but I didn't know how to bridge the gap. We had always had a strained relationship, but now it felt like there was an insurmountable chasm between us. She had always been emotionally distant, but this felt different. This was a complete unwillingness to face what had happened to Grandpa. In the days that followed, I found myself reaching out to Aunt Ruth more and more. She seemed to be the only one who understood, the only one who didn't avoid the tough conversations. She and I began to talk regularly, about Grandpa, about the family, about everything that had gone wrong. One evening, as I sat in my apartment, staring at the small collection of photos I had of Grandpa, my phone rang. It was Aunt Ruth. "I've been thinking about everything," she said, her voice strained. "I don't know if you're ready to hear this, but I need to tell you something else." I felt my stomach tighten. What could she possibly say now? After everything, was there more to this story? "I don't know if this will make sense, but I need you to understand something," Aunt Ruth continued. "Your mom, she's never been able to deal with things." "Not really." "It's not just with Grandpa. It's like, she just shuts down when things get tough. She's been doing it for years. She didn't step up with him because she couldn't, she doesn't know how to handle it. And maybe she just thought if she ignored it long enough, it would go away. That's how she's always dealt with things." I sat there in silence, her words sinking in. My mind was racing. It wasn't just that my mom had been cold and distant. It was more than that. She had built an entire life around avoidance, around not confronting the things that scared her. It had worked for her for years, but it hadn't worked with Grandpa. And now, it felt like everything was coming to a head. "Do you think she'll ever see it?" I asked, barely able to form the words. Aunt Ruth paused before replying. "I don't know. I don't know if she's capable of facing it. But I do know that you shouldn't carry the weight of this alone, Isabel. You were there for him when no one else was, and that matters. It matters more than anything." I felt a small sense of relief wash over me. Maybe it wasn't about fixing the broken relationships right away. Maybe it was about acknowledging what had happened, and giving myself permission to feel what I felt. I had spent so much time trying to make sense of it all, trying to fix things that were beyond repair, but perhaps the first step was simply to accept that some things couldn't be fixed. I didn't know where this journey would take me. I didn't know if my mom and I would ever come to terms with the truth. But Aunt Ruth was right about one thing, I wasn't alone in this. She understood, and that made all the difference. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to feel a little less angry, a little less alone. It wasn't much, but it was a start. But as the weeks passed, I knew that there were still conversations I had to have. Conversations with Mom. Conversations with Julia. Conversations that would force us to face the truth. Because as much as I wanted to walk away and leave the past behind, I knew deep down that it would never be truly behind me until we had that reckoning. And I didn't know if I was ready for that yet. But one thing was certain, I wasn't going to carry the burden of Grandpa's last days alone. Not anymore. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had to change, but I didn't know where to begin. The guilt I carried around with me, the feeling that I had somehow failed Grandpa, still weighed heavily. But Aunt Ruth had made it clear that I wasn't alone in carrying that burden. That, perhaps, was the key. I spent the next few weeks trying to piece everything together. I didn't want to live in a world where my family was broken beyond repair, but I couldn't keep pretending that nothing had happened. I wasn't going to just move on and forget how they had all let Grandpa slip away without truly listening to him. Something had to be done, but it needed to come from a place of strength, not bitterness. I decided to confront my mom. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was something that had to happen if I was ever going to move forward. I needed her to face what she had done, or rather, what she hadn't done. I called her one evening and asked if we could meet up. "I know you're busy," I said, my voice steady. "But I need to talk to you." It didn't take much to convince her to meet me at a small cafe we used to go to together. When I arrived, I saw her sitting at the table, looking exactly as she always did, perfectly put together, as if everything were fine. She gave me a tight smile as I sat down. "Is everything okay, Isabel?" she asked, her tone casual. But I could hear the underlying tension in her voice. She knew something was coming. "No, Mom. Everything's not okay," I said, my voice more firm than I expected. "I need you to listen to me. I'm not angry at you for how you handled Grandpa's illness, but I need you to understand what you did, or didn't do. You weren't there for him. You weren't there when he needed help the most." She blinked, clearly caught off guard. She opened her mouth to say something, but I raised my hand to stop her. "You didn't step up. You kept telling me to be more like Julia, as if I wasn't already doing everything I could. I called you when Grandpa needed help. You didn't even pick up the phone. And when you did, you told me to handle it myself." I could see the defensive look in her eyes, the one she always used when she was confronted with something uncomfortable. But I wasn't going to let her hide behind that anymore. "I know it's hard for you, Mom. But you've spent your whole life avoiding the hard stuff. Grandpa was begging for help, and I couldn't give it to him. No one could. Because we were all too busy pretending everything was fine." She looked away, her gaze shifting uncomfortably to the coffee cup in front of her. "I didn't know what to do," she muttered, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "I didn't know how to help him." "I know," I said, my tone softer now. "But you could have at least tried. He needed someone. I needed you." There was a long pause, and for a moment, I thought she was going to get up and leave. But then, slowly, her face softened, and I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't seen in years: guilt. Real guilt. "I wasn't strong enough," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't know how to handle it. You were right to be angry. You were right about everything." I didn't know what to say in that moment. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to tell her that it was too late for apologies. But another part of me, the part that still loved her, knew that she was finally acknowledging the truth. And that was the first step. "I'm not going to let you pretend it didn't happen, Mom," I said, my voice more measured now. "But I think we can start over. We can try to fix this, together." Her eyes welled up with tears, but she didn't say anything more. The silence that fell between us wasn't uncomfortable, though. It was more like a shared understanding, an unspoken promise that we would try, even if it meant facing things we had been avoiding for years. The next step was Julia. My sister. The one who had seemed so untouchable for so long. I hadn't expected much from her, but deep down, I knew that if we were going to heal as a family, I needed her to see the truth too. I called her, but unlike with Mom, this conversation didn't start with an invitation to coffee. I was angry, and I didn't have the patience to sugarcoat anything. "Julia, we need to talk," I said when she picked up. "I'm busy, Isabel," she replied, already sounding irritated. "What's this about?" "It's about Grandpa," I said, cutting to the chase. "And how you were never there for him. You barely visited him when he was alive, and now you're acting like nothing happened." I could feel her stiffen on the other end of the line, but I wasn't going to back down. "You don't get to act like you were a part of his life in his final months. You weren't. You didn't care. And that hurts, Julia. Because I needed you." There was a long silence, and for a moment, I thought she might hang up. But then, surprisingly, she sighed. "I know," she said, her voice quieter now. "I was a coward. I didn't want to face what was happening. And I didn't want to feel guilty, so I just stayed away." Her admission hit me harder than I expected. I had always thought of Julia as perfect, untouchable, but here she was, owning up to her own failures. "I don't know how to make this right, Isabel," she continued. "But I'm sorry. I should have been there. I should have done more." I was silent for a moment, processing what she said. It didn't erase everything, but it was a start. She was taking responsibility for once, and that meant something. "I'm not saying I can forgive you right away," I said, my voice steady. "But I need you to know that Grandpa needed you. And we all failed him." "I know," she whispered. "I know." The weeks that followed weren't easy. The conversations with my mom and Julia didn't magically fix everything. But something had shifted in me. I didn't need their approval or validation anymore. I had faced the truth, about my family, about myself, and I could finally start to let go of the anger and resentment that had been eating away at me. As for my revenge, it wasn't the dramatic, destructive kind I might have imagined in my younger years. It was something quieter, something that felt more powerful in the end. I had forced my family to confront the truth. I had made them face their actions and their inactions, and in doing so, I had reclaimed my own sense of agency. That was the justice I needed. I wasn't going to let Grandpa's suffering go unnoticed, and I wasn't going to let my family sweep it under the rug. I had done what I could, and I had made sure that the truth came out. In the end, that was all I could control. Months later, I found myself visiting Grandpa's grave, standing alone in the quiet cemetery. I placed a bouquet of flowers on the stone and whispered a final goodbye. "I'm sorry, Grandpa," I said softly, my voice catching. "I wish I could have done more. But I promise I won't forget." As I stood there, the weight of everything finally started to lift. I had fought for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. I had confronted my family, and I had forced them to see what they had missed. It wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. And that felt like enough.